gives me great pleasure to introduce Rabbi Ralph Genende. Rabbi Genende is due to retire shortly as Senior Rabbi of the Caulfield Hebrew Congregation after 14 years. He has a passion for social justice and creating bridges between different cultures and faiths. For him, the purpose of religion is to create a better society for all people and to engage with critical issues facing Australian society. As such, he is Senior Rabbi and Multifaith Advisor to the ADF, a founding member of the Multicultural Advisory Committee, which Denise spoke about earlier, a former president of the Jewish Christian Muslim Association, a board member of the Australia-Israel Jewish Affairs Council, and was a long-time executive of the Rabbinical Association of Victoria. When thinking about who our orator should be for the Shirley Sedawie Annual Oration this year, we actually had unanimous agreement that it should be Rabbi Genende, given his long-time experience in multi-faith activities. And the other thing I wanted to share is, not this, but a picture. This one is a picture, as you see, I've known Rabbi Genende for a while, and we actually participated in a trip to Israel a few years ago. This is a group of us from the Jewish Christian Muslim Association in Jerusalem. And so I've seen his work up close, especially in his engagement with the multi-faith, interfaith community. And so, as I say, it was a unanimous decision for us to choose Rabbi Genende, and his topic for our oration is comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable, reflections in the life of a rabbi in the Jewish community and beyond. So Rabbi Genende, over to you.
Thanks, Alex. Yes, it was just a reminder in that photo of times when we could be there in Jerusalem. And obviously our thoughts are with Jerusalem, but also I remember that trip particularly of actually getting to know Alex and getting to see and recognize just the kind of person he is and the kind of work that he is now obviously doing for the Council of Christians and Jews. So I think fortunate to have him, and want to compliment Alex. I want to compliment you all on the important work that you continue to do. I also want to also add my acknowledgements to the Wurundjeri people and also Kulin Nation where I'm sitting, and thank them for this good land that we are sharing with them now, and recognizing their culture and spirituality of their elders, and of their present leadership and of their history and of what it contributes of what it means to our country. It's also the pleasure of doing this this particular oration because I did meet Shirley, because I was actually an executive member of the CCJ here. I see Albert, I think just put it up on the chat there. So I think you were around then, Albert, on the executive. I don't know if anyone else was at that particular time, but it was not long after I arrived in Melbourne, and I remember it very fondly. And I also remember Shirley's warm and welcoming smile, her energy, her capacity for friendship, her intelligence, and her passion for enhancing Jewish-Christian relationships. I may be stepping down from Caulfield Shul. I figured after 13 years, I stepped down. I announced my retirement there of 13 years. I'm certainly not intending to retire from the Jewish community, and there'll be an announcement this week of something else that I'll be taking on within the Jewish community very shortly. And I must say that my first introduction to the Council of Christians and Jews was actually in Auckland, where I was previously as a rabbi in Auckland, coming from South Africa. South Africa there was very little in terms, I don't know, perhaps today there is a branch of the Council of Christians and Jews there. I hope there was. I don't think there was when I was a young rabbi. In fact, I don't think I met a Christian clergy, or probably met very few Christians, till I was in the South African Defence Force as a chaplain and had to work with the chaplains from different denominations then, mainly from the Dutch Reformed Church, which was something of an eye-opener itself, dealing with some of the clergy from there. and their viewpoints, particularly of their interpretation of the scriptures when it came to apartheid and justifying apartheid with the biblical quotes, from the story of Noah and the children of Noah. That was quite something. I think that's what got me to flee from there on an ark to get away from South Africa as quickly as I could from the bad old apartheid days. But I was invited into the Council of Christians and Jews in Auckland. I was somewhat wary of it, and I came straight into, I think it was the time when I came straight into a controversy there, which was with the Anglican Church in New Zealand having introduced a motion. They wanted to introduce introduced a new prayer book, book of Psalms rather, where they wanted to delete any references to Zion from the Psalms. And there was some really fierce debate that was going on there. And I remember thinking, I know the Psalms can be pretty challenging and combative in their own way. Adonai Ish Milchama, God is a man of war, for example. But it's also the Psalms, of course, have for us the greatest expression of pain and of pathos and of poignancy and of prayer, which unites Christians and Jews through those beautiful Psalms. And then, I think there's somebody who's probably done more for the Book of Psalms than anybody else in this century, was a man called Leonard Cohen. I think he maybe reminded a good few people and secularists of the term hallelujah, of praising God, which of course is one of the motifs of the book of Psalms. But I think the Psalms were meant to get us to wrestle with prayer. Prayer itself, in the Hebrew word for prayer, is one of wrestling, litpalel, wrestling with God and wrestling with ourselves. But if I had to give a title to today, and I notice there are a few people here who have heard me speaking about this in the last few weeks, but I'm sort of developing an idea I've been thinking of, because we, in Jewish tradition, as you know, we read something of the Torah every single week. And currently we're reading the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, the 5th book, which, according to tradition, not according to our literary critics and the School of Criticism, but according to tradition, it was the final words and oration of Moses over some five weeks before his death, and where he is reflecting on his leadership. And I certainly in no way can compare myself to a Moses, but when one looks at Moshe Rabbeinu, when we look at Moses and his reflections, I thought it's always a great starting point for one's own reflections. It's a strange thing to suddenly start reflecting. I don't feel, that I'm at that stage yet. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with my favorite poet is Yeats, Irish poet, William Butler Yeats. And he wrote a poem called Among School Children. And I'm going to read you a little bit of it, because I think you'll see why I think it's relevant to what I'm about to say. And he said, among school children, I walked through the long schoolroom questioning. A kind old nun in a white hood replies. The children learn to cipher and to sing, to study reading books and histories, to cut and sew, be neat in everything, in the best modern way. The children's eyes in momentary wonder stare upon a 60-year-old smiling public man. And I thought of these words because I suddenly thought, suddenly you reach a stage where you become a patrician and you have a right to start pontificating to the world about one's reflections and thoughts. And here I am reflecting on my life as a rabbi in the Jewish community over some 30 plus years. And I think, the 60-something-year-old smiling public man. But I also think of the kind nuns who were so much part of facilitating the Sisters of Zion, facilitating the Council of Christians and Jews here in Melbourne. What were Moses's messages? I could summarize Moses's messages. You may, and I think looking at sort of the age of people on the screen, you've kind of probably heard the expression, the 4 L's. 4 L's, ELLS, which was actually, in Manchester, was the measure of a certain measure of cloth. And from that measure of cloth, Manchester, as you know, is very famous for its cotton mills and its beautiful fabrics that it created. And one of the measures was the 4 L's. It's like 4 cubits, which was, of course, from the elbow to the tip of a middle finger of an average-sized man, was where the expression comes from. It's called nama in Hebrew. And I thought of, well, if the 4 L's, which was so important for the fabric industry, what about to borrow another phrase from William Butler Yeats, where he talks about the cloths of heaven, and he speaks of, so what are the cloths? What are the 4 L's of the cloths of heaven? What were the 4 L's that Moses was giving? And now I'm just playing a bit, I'm being a bit punny, playing with not the ELLS, but playing with the letter L now, and saying Moses had to give 4 L's. What were the 4 L's of his message, final message to the people before his departure, before his death? And I'd say the first of the first L's was the one that I encountered when I was in Auckland with about the issue of the Book of Psalms and deleting references to Zion, because the first L that Moses, of course, was saying to his people, you're about to go into your own land, L number 1. And what is it going to mean to have a people possessing your own land and no longer to be an exilic people, no longer to be a slave nation, but now to create your own sovereign state? And I think it's always a central. I think it's a central challenge of an organization like CCJ, and especially one like the JCMA, Jewish Christian Muslim Association, is how to honor and recognize the Jewish connection to their ancient land within a complex, convoluted reality of a modern state. How to counter the outrageous claims that Israel is a criminal apartheid state, prime violator of human rights, exclusive occupier in the world without restraint and principle. Now, I want to make it very clear, I really do believe we have a right to criticize Israel. I personally worry deeply over the continuing cost to Israel's soul as an occupier. I am as part of the land that it does occupy, in the West Bank. I sometimes do see some of the unwelcome shades of apartheid in the unequal and shameful treatment of some Palestinians, particularly those in the West Bank and Arabs and Bedouins who are citizens of Israel. But it shouldn't blind us to the remarkable achievement of a resilient, flourishing democracy where all religions are respected. You know, Thomas Friedman, well-known journalist, American journalist, who's written several interesting books as well. Thomas Friedman put it many years ago, but I think it's just as relevant now as it was then. He said, criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic, and saying so is vile. But constantly singling out Israel for opprobrium, for international sanction out of all proportion to any other party in the Middle East, and I would say, think Syria, think Iran, think Yemen, that's anti-Semitic. And not saying so is dishonest. So I would say when we think about land, was Moses giving his message, the first one was that he was reminding people the centrality of this piece of land would be to their consciousness, to their identity, and to their spirituality. And living in Australia, as we pay and acknowledge the connection of our First Peoples here, I think we can see what land and the significance of land, and not trying to rob people of land and how important that is. That would be my number one, my first L. Second one is, the second L that I think that Moses gave was the one called big L for learning. And learning is something that's always been fundamental to the Jewish people. In fact, the very name rabbi comes from Rebbe, or Rabbi, my rabbi, my teacher. A rabbi is fundamentally a teacher. That is how he got that was really his fundamental status. And that was, Moses is many things for us as a Jewish people, as he is as a world religious figure. Moses, of course, is a prophet. Moses becomes pretty wily politician. Moses is a man who challenges his people. I think Moses is something of a poet. But in Jewish tradition, we don't refer to him as Moshe Navi, Moses the prophet. We don't talk about him as Moses the leader. We don't talk about him as Moses the orator, which he does become after starting off rather shakily. But he does become, and he is known in Jewish tradition as Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our rabbi, Moses our teacher, Moses our educator. And education, and being part of an education nation, is really so fundamental to Jewish identity, and therefore it was, of course, an intrinsic part of my work within the rabbinate, and as I think probably my Christian counterparts would agree, is to be an educator, to try and to teach, to engage, to stimulate the minds and the thoughts of our of all those we come across. And I've always seen this, but it's a great challenge. I think that there is often just an antipathy that I encounter among sort of average Melbourne Jewish congregant to sort of doing some study. And we speak about studying every single day. Moses's, the most famous prayer in Jewish life is called the Shema Yisrael. I'm going to come back to that. But one of the fundamental phrases of the Shema Yisrael is Limadatem otam b'nechem, teach your children well. Teach your children diligently. The word in shinantim in Hebrew is make them sharp. In other words, teaching is not just a transmission of information or an accumulation of knowledge, but it is a transmission of the most exciting ideas, challenges that can be around. What could be more exciting to a young mind than to open it up to the creativity of ideas? And that surely is what could be more important for an adult and for people in, our third age, to, if not stimulating creativity, thought, learning something every single day. We know it's good also just for our brains, but how good is learning for our souls? And I'm talking, of course, here about the learning of religious learning, of religious nature, but I don't confine it to that, because part of the tradition I come from, which calls itself modern orthodoxy, believes in a way of fusing our Torah knowledge with the knowledge of the world, and of recognizing, as we do, the value of ideas of chokhmah, of wisdom that comes from all kinds of sources, from all kinds of religions, from all other people. We can gain so much. If we know who we are open to learning from others without feeling insecure or feeling threatened by ideas that are challenging, that are different to our ideas. So, learning, limadatem, teaching. By the way, one of the names for a house, a Jewish house of worship, is often the Beit HaMidrash. A shul, synagogue, is called a Beit Knesset, a place where people gather. It is a Beit Tefillah, it is a place where people pray, but it's also a Beit Midrash. It's a place where people come and should come to learn, to engage with their tradition, to engage with their history, to engage with ideas, and to engage, hopefully, with ideas of other people as well. So learning, number 2, Moses's message. We've had land and learning. I think his third one, I put 2 L's together for the third one, and I put them together and I call them love and listening. And I think the 2 of them actually do go together. The book of Deuteronomy has more references to love than any of the other 5 books of Moses. And it could be that as Moses is approaching his own end, he wants to give, because Moses is not always perceived as the man of great love. Maybe his brother Aaron is more so, but he's perceived, certainly, perceived as the great lawgiver. But what about the man of love? And yet Moses has, as there are no more than, I think it's 26 or 27 references to the book, to the word love in the book of Deuteronomy itself. And it is one of the phrases that is in that Shema Yisrael prayer, that basic fundamental prayer of Judaism. V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha v'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha v'chol modecha. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Love is not neutral. Love is your heart. It's with your soul. It's with your strength. And basic to love, of course, there are different kinds of love that the 5 books that Moses himself has taught. Moses taught us the fundamental principle. There's the love of God. He has also taught us earlier on in the book of Leviticus, chapter 18, I think it's verse 18, V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, you shall love sorry, ve'ahavta l'oreacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. Of course, the golden rule, love your neighbor. And there's only a third expression of love where it says, you shall love, in the book of the 5 books in the Pentateuch itself. So the one is love of God, as we've seen. The other is love of your neighbor. And the third one is v'ahavtem et hager, love the stranger. 3 fundamental challenges of love, 3 kinds of love. And of course, which one's the easier? I don't think any of them are easy. But some may argue, well, love your neighbor. Some have said, yes, love your neighbor, but choose your neighborhood. That's what makes it a lot easier. And a lot of people would probably like to focus on the latter part of that phrase, as yourself, because loving self comes very naturally and very easily to many. And how do we escape how do we escape the cell of narcissism, which is a challenge, I think, throughout our lives, to break out of that and to share with the other. And I like the comment when we were speaking about love of stranger that came in my class when I was teaching it a few weeks ago. And I think the point we made is that that we may find it easy to listen to those we love, but the truth is, if we will learn to love those who we don't usually listen to. And that is a great challenge, to love those who we don't listen to naturally, which of course is the stranger. Such a fundamental challenge that it is to hear voices that are different to our voices. Particularly, we're living in such polarized times where the polarization is only accentuated and increased with the coronavirus, with what we are living for. Our hope had been, and I still would like to hope, but I don't know if it's, but despite myself, that the pandemic will bring us closer to listening to others who are different to us, rather than and seeing, and but we know that the pandemic has opened up and shown us the great divergence there is between those who have not, even with accessibility to the well, what do you call it, the jab. How those who have, it's easier to get it if you have, and if you have not, harder to get it in so many countries across the world, and a real challenge for us to make sure the strangers and those who are different from us and cannot afford it are given the same accessibility to it. There was a line that just, I was thinking of the Psalms, which came to me this morning. Funny, if you read a Psalm, you read a prayer every single day, and sometimes you can miss the very significance of it. And the one that I'm thinking of this wasn't from Psalms, this is from a prayer that comes from the book of Chronicles that we say every single day. 1 Chronicles chapter 16, where it says, give thanks to the Lord, call on his name, proclaim his deeds among the peoples. Hodu l'Hashem kiru v'shmo, hodi'o v'amim alilotav. Call on his name. And it's a comment that came from a man whose name was Rabbi Kook, first chief rabbi of the modern state of Israel. And he was a remarkable man, a poet, philosopher. And I imagine he could cook up a storm wherever he went, this Rabbi Kook. And one of the things that Rabbi Kook said, he said, calling out in God's name, he says, is not accomplished by everyone in the same way. He says there's one who sings the song of his soul, and he finds all within his soul is complete, full of spiritual satisfaction. I think it's just gendered because that was the time he was writing it. Then there is the one who sings the song of the nation. It's a different kind of song. And there is the one whose soul broadens until it emerges and spreads beyond the borders of Israel to sing the song of humanity. And then he says there is the one who transcends more broadly until this person unites with the entirety of existence, with all the creatures, with all the world, with all of them, and recites the praises of God. And I thought, well, that's quite a challenge. And to me, that's the challenge of a religious leader, the challenge of a rabbi, it's the challenge of a spiritual person, is to, we're calling out God's name. We're calling out a message that we believe is vital, important, and challenging for humanity for today. And we are saying that our message and the voice, and this is something that needs to be heard in our civil society and in the conversation of our country and in the conversation of humanity. I think humanity hasn't begun to realize how much poorer it becomes as it deafens itself to the words of religion, to the words of our scriptures, as it shuts off its ears to the words of God, which is so much so apparent in the world today. And maybe part of what you mentioned, Denise, earlier on, even this debate about the Lord's Prayer, is about, are we closing our ears to the voice of prayer and to how it can nurture and strengthen, and is so vital for the human soul, for the human spirit. Listening to is, of course, we know, is one of the basic requirements for any relationship. Failure to listen destroys a marriage. A failure to listen destroys a relationship between parents and children. A failure to listen destroys communities' capacity to be effective. So we need to constantly work on our own listening and constantly emphasize the importance of listening to our congregations, to our world. And that is always seen as one of my fundamental challenges as a rabbi, is to be able to listen. And they're very often, as it is one of the temptations of anyone in this kind of position, is to believe that you have more to say than rather to hear, and how we stand in great danger as any religious leader when you stop listening to the voices. And sometimes the voices within Jewish tradition, and I don't know if it's to the same extent in the church or across the churches, but certainly my congregants have no problem telling me what was wrong and what could be done better. And not for nothing, the Jewish people call this Amkshe Orif, the stiff-necked people, because one of our foibles as a people, we are very opinionated very often, and very, very forward, not backwards in being forward in our opinions. And that, as a community rabbi, so you certainly encounter a lot of opinions. Sometimes the opinions come via, they don't come directly to you, they come via the back channels. But I think it's important to listen to them even when they're not necessarily all valid points. One doesn't have to react to everything, and one has to have, as wise King Solomon told us, we've got to be able to know when to be silent and when to speak out as well. When it is to listen, but not necessarily to respond. But how listening is just so much of it is the key to so much of the rabbinate, to clergy, to I think to the voice of spirituality in the world. And to listen, of course, is also then, and that is, to listen is to hear the voices and the pain very often of those, to hear the unspoken voices as well. To listen and to hear the pain of so many in our communities, so many across the world, and to listen with, not just with our ears, but to listen with our heart, and to those who are in pain, who are in sorrow, and those who are suffering. And there is no shortage of that in these present times as well. But if listening is so important, and listening with love is so important, so is the necessity for a leader to be able to sometimes say things that people will find hard to listen to and to hear, and to be unafraid to say those kind of things. I've always seen my role as being primarily to comfort the afflicted, to comfort those in need, but also to afflict the comfortable, and to challenge. And as a voice of orthodoxy, of modern orthodoxy, where as an orthodox tradition suggests, it's a very conservative kind of tradition, and voices that are more outgoing and contemporary are not always welcome. And therefore, on issues of great social gravity to us in Australia, whether it is how we treat our fellow, the First Peoples of this land, how we react to racism, how we react to Islamophobia, how we react to the treatment of those who feel so marginalized by our society, be it the homeless or be it those in the GLBTIQ movement, that we have to, or whether it is an issue which, yes, divisive issue, challenging issues like climate change itself, environmental issues, I have always felt that it is my responsibility to be a voice for them. And, that's why there was a very wise old rabbi called the Mussar tradition who said that if everybody in the community loves their rabbi, there's something wrong with the rabbi. And, it's, of course, we want to be popular, we want to be liked, but we cannot be liked at the cost of principle and of things that need to be said, and that need to be heard. There was a one which he said why anyone would want to become a spiritual leader, and he said why should anyone want to become a rabbi in the first place? And he said there's probably three reasons. He says, number one, three short answers. A person must be meshuga. Meshuga in Hebrew means just crazy, or in Yiddish, it's got to be crazy. What do you want to take this upon yourself? Life is tough enough without being a religious leader. Or you're and this is, and it sounds so much better in the Yiddish, but I think you'll get something of the taste of it, even if you don't know it. So you're either going to be meshuga, or you're going to be a shlamil. That a shlamil is just how the word itself, kind of a slimy word that says one who unable to find employment in any other sphere. So just that's obviously had to go into the clergy. And the others, or maybe they're actually a genuine idealist, which is possible. I'd like hopeful as well. And and part of it is it has been said, and I don't know if there's truth to this, and my fellow clergy may have some thoughts or statements about it, but some said, why, that talking about the drawbacks of being in a clergy position, in a position of being a rabbi, he says is that he says where else, he says, I'm just quoting, he says, where else can you be really crazy and eccentric? If you try it in business, you're going to lose your money or job. If you try it at home, your spouse is going to let you know. But when it comes to shul, congregation, any and every troublemaker is allowed to get away with being meshuga with impunity. And, it sometimes does seem to be, that eccentricity is given more credence than it should be given and would not be given in other places. And it's often the clergy person can be the butt of this and be of the abuse. And there is, and I said in the sense that with some seriousness, we do know there is an issue of clergy abuse as well, of bullying of members of the clergy by their boards and sometimes by congregational members, and that needs to be. And I think that we are not always mindful enough of it in our protection of people who are members of the clergy. And there is, of course, a price to pay too if you decide to afflict the comfortable, because they may decide then that you're to up yourself, and who are you to tell us this kind of thing, etc. So I say, there is a price that one pays. It doesn't come, you're not just some kind of great hero because you're saying things which others are afraid to say or people may be afraid to hear. It comes at a cost. One has to develop a pretty thick skin as well. Maybe just another thing that we should hand out armor to people who become members of the clergy as well. So that was my part of that, and I haven't really, and I haven't spoken about the component that comes with the listening, of course, is the love. I haven't spoken about it specifically, but there is, I just want to quote with you something from that comes from the journalist, what was his name? He was quoted by, it was in one of the last books of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. He quoted David Brooks, who's a very insightful, I think it's an insightful moralist, he's an insightful journalist and writer for our time. And David Brooks writes, and this particular sentence really caught me. He said, "My favorite definition of commitment is falling in love with something and then building a structure of behavior around it for the moment when love falters." In other words, falling in love with something, that moment, that heady, wonderful feeling, but it is transient, it's evanescent, doesn't last, even if, and I'm sure that, I always tell the young couples who come, and we do our pre-marriage counseling, yes, ask them, do you think love conquers all? Love is the most important thing. Well, think about it, yes, but how are you going to stay in love, not just fall in love? And that's where we say building a structure around it for the moment when love falters, because love does falter in the very best relationships, and it's often, as we know, from the faltering and from the fault lines is how we strengthen love, and something we need to really remind too many young couples who give up so very easily today in their marriages, of that love is not even, and love is not just about growing strong all the time, but that it falters and it falls from time to time as well. Staying the course, staying in love, and that is part of one of the things and I think one of the things that a rabbi needs to, and the clergy, any people in the clergy need to, is how do we stay the distance without becoming completely burnt out? How do we, we can fall out of love with our congregations so very easily as well. And it's building the structures around. And that is where just, and one of the things which I think is one of the misunderstood concepts of where Judaism is seen as this system of law, and the love is played down. I think that one of the things we owe to Christianity is the beauty and the power which they have shared God's love in the world. But I think we also need to often to remind people that Judaism was not this, as was sometimes, as portrayed in some Christian writings, as this narrow, legalistic, dry as dust kind of religion, but that the love and the law are so inextricably bound together within Jewish life. And that's the L that I want to convey as a rabbi. And I think, by the way, what we can learn from the church as well is to speak more about love, because it's not a word that I hear, I believe, often enough within synagogues, within Jewish life. I don't hear it emphasized enough. And I think we are living in an age, in an age now, a loveless age. I think, what's the name of the novel about love in an age of cholera? Was that the name of it? Is the name of, and I think about it now. Love in an age of pandemic is so very vital, and we are so in danger of that compassion fatigue and love fatigue. As we're going through here in Melbourne through our sixth lockdown, and all that love which was generated initially seems to be dissipating, and there's more fatigue. And also just that compassion fatigue, which is replacing it. And we, as people of the spirit and religion, need to ensure that we counter that as much as we possibly can. By the way, if we have if we have the seventh lockdown, we can call it a sabbatical. We've got a sabbatical coming on the way, probably. Who knows? My final L for this afternoon I'll just remind you of the others. We looked at land, we looked at learning, we looked at love and listening. And the final one I would say is one which is current, and that's why I'm thinking about it, liberty. So we have people, and Moses was proclaiming liberty throughout the land. Kratim Dror Ba'aretz, one of his most famous resounding statements of how the human spirit is nourished by liberty. And it was one of the great lessons. Of course, Moses is the great freedom fighter brought to the world. Heinrich Heine said that ever since the Exodus, freedom, liberty has had a Hebrew accent, and liberty was born there in the sands of Sinai, and born in Egypt, and the importance of human beings to be free, but liberty not in the sense that we have this strange, and I find it strange, perplexing, and sometimes and even maddening, when people who are in our streets protesting against the restrictions that we have to have, but doing it in the name of liberty, freedom. We know that as Isaiah Berlin famously, in a famous essay of his, made the distinction between freedom from and freedom to. And freedom from is, freedom from any restrictions, inhibitions, limitations, and responsibilities. Is that freedom? It is a kind of freedom. For me, it's a freedom of anarchy, freedom of nihilism. That is a kind of freedom. But the real freedom is the freedom to create within structure. And that real freedom comes with responsibility and comes with restraint. And probably the easiest way we can convey that to people is that, if you want to be free to play the violin, you've got to practice. You've got to be incredibly diligent about it. I think it was Tagore used the same image. He said that I can have a violin string lying here, but is it free to produce music? No, it only becomes free when I tie it, when I bind it to the instrument itself, when I restrain it in the instrument, then it becomes free to produce what it is meant to produce, the beautiful music that it is meant to produce. So we struggle with freedom. Even in our liberal democratic societies, and I think our freedom is really a thing that Moses perhaps reminded us is so much under threat in the world today, with with a China resurgent, Russia expressing it where freedom is just another word and not something to be valued in the way that I think most of us do value it. And but I think, so one of the fun thing, the way I translated then into my rabbinic practice is through the words of Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, where he says, "Behold, I place before you this day a blessing and a curse," or as he puts it later on, life and death. Choose life, choose blessing. And a remarkable message, which is such application and resonance today, is the choices that we make continue to define the people who we are, and that we are still free to make choices even under restricted circumstances, even under confinement. You can find a sense of freedom. Some of the greatest freedom fighters of this last century brought that home to us, and I'm thinking of Nelson Mandela, his long road to freedom. I'm thinking of Anatoly Sharansky, prisoner of Zion, and both of them expressed it beautifully and articulated how they had never felt as free as when they were actually in their cells, when they were imprisoned by in their oppressive regimes. But I conclude with this idea of freedom, of making choices. In the last year, Edith Eger's book, The Choice, which I'm sure many of you have come across. Edith Eger, survivor of Auschwitz, who many years later she becomes a psychotherapist. She loses her whole family in Auschwitz, and she survives the horrors of there and the death marches. And a remarkable book, The Choice. It appeared first in 2017, actually. And she really is a living testimony to that powerful assertion of Viktor Frankl, who said that they took away in the death camps, he said, they took away every freedom except the freedom of how to respond. And she puts it that she says victimhood is optional, because she makes the differentiation between victimization and victimhood. You know, we are all at some time in our life victimized by abuse or injury or ill fortune or by a pandemic. You know, we live exposed to forces that are beyond our control. But victimization comes from the outside, but victimhood comes from the inside. And no one, as she puts it, can make you a victim but you yourself. So we have to choose to be masters of our destiny, captains of our own destiny. One of the great fundamental truths that our religions teach us, that and one of the great fundamental truths that I hope that I can continue to convey to my congregants. So I started off telling you about the 4 L's, and these are the 4 L's that have sustained me, continue to sustain me as I go forward in my rabbinate in a somewhat different type of role, but still working for the community, and in my work in the wider community, which I value so very much. You know, it was Maya Angelou, great American poet, who said, and I was trying to find the exact words that are of it so that I don't mess it up. How did Maya Angelou put it here? Yes, she once remarked, at the end of the day, people won't remember what you said or what you did. They will remember how you made them feel. And I think that, for me, that has been something that has guided my rabbinate. You know, I know I've probably given thousands of sermons and done thousands of acts, but I think that what has been so valuable is knowing sometimes that I have had the privilege of being with people in their deepest sorrow and anguish, and in their highest moments of elation and joy, and sometimes just in the ordinary mundane times with people where they show a remarkable heroism, a remarkable authenticity and beauty. And what a gift it has been, what gift God has given to allow me to do that, to as part of my role as a rabbi, to learn and to love and to listen and to give. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Everyone's showing their appreciation. And you've certainly made us feel uplifted by your presentation. So thank you very much for that. We've got time for maybe 2 or 3 questions, Rabbi, if you're happy to participate. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. I think Albert is first, so please unmute yourself, and you can ask your question.
Thank you, Rabbi, for a very, very inspiring talk. I was very interested to hear that you agreed with Reverend Denise and expressed concern over the possibility of a prayer being deleted from parliamentary procedure in Victoria. It might be a Christian prayer, but there is really nothing in the prayer that is not Jewish. I don't know whether you remember, Rabbi, but some years ago I was part of a panel organised by this council on the theme, how Jewish is the communion and how Jewish is the Lord's Prayer. And I made the point that the Lord's Prayer and the most recited Jewish prayer, the Kaddish, have exactly the same themes, completely different words, but if you look at the themes in order, they are exactly the same. the only difference, if you like, Jews have a different interpretation of the word father to the interpretation that Christians would put on it, but in every other respect, Jews should have absolutely no trouble with that prayer. And if it is going to be deleted, it is just one more example of the secularization of this society, which is something very sad to see. And I'd like your comments, please.
You know, it's been interesting because I have been following it on MAG, and this is one. I actually happen to believe when I read, I think the Lord's Prayer is a universal prayer, and I think it's got universal resonance to it, and therefore for one thought, would think we'd be poorer without it, but I also would worry about what would be substituted, and I know there've been various things, and I often I worry about neutered kind of prayers replacing something which is so powerful and is so much part of I like to see it as part of our collective civilization. So, I know that not everyone would agree with me, and I certainly am sympathetic because I'm part of a multicultural, and I understand the other voices there. But when I read it, I don't see why it should be offensive to people of any religion. Maybe as you say, maybe phrase here, phrase there is not exactly how we would put it, etc. But on this one, I'm actually with you and Denise.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Maybe one or two more. David Schutz. Unmute yourself, please.
Just unmute myself. Hello, everybody. Hello, Ralph. Thank you very much for your presentation. I won't carry on with that topic that was just mentioned, but again, well said on both issues, and glad to see the similarities in the prayer there. I was interested in the idea of freedom too. I just threw a mention in the chat box as you were talking. I hope that wasn't too rude. Just to say that it was something very strong in Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI's theology, right from the time when he was a young theologian, emphasizing freedom for especially freedom for the other was the purpose of freedom. I'm wondering if, in fact, that's the same idea going there.
It's maybe a little different from the way of putting it, but I think that's an important distinction as well. I think just so making that distinction, that we don't see freedom just as free to do whatever I want to do, but that freedom does come with great responsibility. And thank you for, I've just started reading. I actually haven't, I'd like to see a copy of that, David, because that looks really interesting.
Oh, yes. Okay, I'll get a reference for you. Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's his Introduction to Christianity is where he mentions it first in 1968.
I'm just looking at all these really interesting comments. Thank you, everyone, on the chat there.
And on that note, Colleen, do you want to phrase what you wrote, or ask it, or pose it in a different way?
Oh, thank you, and thank you, Rabbi Genende, for a wonderful talk. I just loved the depth of human wisdom that you shared with us, and that we share as people of faith. I was just struck by the profound Jewishness of the Lord's Prayer, which I think far too few Christians recognize. It's a thoroughly Jewish prayer, of course, and in that sense, therefore, profoundly human. And we would be the losers if we took it from the Parliament, because apart from anything else, it reminds the parliamentarians, actually, there is even a higher power than the state and the authority that they hold. That there is another authority, and it would have had its origins in the English Parliament, where it was a reminder that even the authority of the Crown was subject to God's authority.
I think it's a very pertinent point that you bring about, recognizing something that is, and that's something that there is something also that is greater than the king today, which is called the corona, from the coronial virus. And yes, I certainly, appreciate and thank you for your, comments as well. And I think Albert should circulate, if he's still got his notes on the Jewishness of the Lord's Prayer. It would be interesting to see that.
Yes. I hope that we might be able to contribute to the conversation. Other members of the executive hearing me make these comments now. Perhaps we could ourselves put in, is it too late to put in input?
In fact, it's not. And I was actually speaking to someone just this past week about our potential involvement coming up next year. It's likely to be an issue that will be brought to the fore before next year's state election. So it's likely that sometime next year we'll have more to say, and including potentially an event or other things to do with this matter. So thank you for starting the conversation for us. And on that note, is there any final questions or comments before we pass on to the vote of thanks? I don't think I can see any. So on that note, let me hand over to Mark, our Vice Chair, who'll be doing the vote of thanks to both Reverend Denise and Rabbi Ralph.
It's a great pleasure, Rabbi Ralph, to offer a vote of thanks to you. It was a great pleasure to have known Sister Shirley Sedawie, who is a teacher of mine. She taught me Hebrew many years ago at a kitchen table in Kings Park. And I think she would resonate very strongly with everything that you had to say to us this afternoon. And I greatly appreciate your contribution as an educator, your contribution to the process of learning, which you emphasized so strongly, your connection to land and respect for that, your capacity to listen and the love that is at the heart of that listening. I greatly appreciate your placing that almost at the middle of what you were saying today, at the heart of what you shared for us, that love of God, love of neighbor, and love of stranger. And we might add what another rabbi said to that as well, and that is love of enemy. Jesus said that, and I think it's really important, and it's a real struggle and a real challenge for us to act out of love. And I appreciate very much your reminder to us of that. And then finally, that sense of liberty. I work for Edmund Rice Education Australia, and in our acknowledgement of country, we speak about walking together towards mutual liberation. And I think liberation, if it's truly liberation, freedom, if it's truly freedom, is not freedom or liberation for the individual or our society or our group or members of one tradition. It is liberation for all. So thank you so much for your contribution this afternoon to the Sister Shirley Sedawie Oration. It is greatly appreciated, and I offer you sincere thanks for everything that you've shared with us. And I invite everyone to acknowledge that as well.
Thank you.
And it's my final task to return to the beginning. Reverend Denise Leash, thank you so much for the beautiful way that you led us through our AGM today. Thank you for the way in which you drew us into this as not just business, not just something we had to do, but as a task that was sacred. And you shared that through your reflections on prayer and the importance of that and what we offer. So I thank you very, very much for your contribution this afternoon, and wish you every blessing.
I think the only thing I have to do now is to thank everyone for their attendance, thank everyone for their participation, and for listening. As Rabbi reminded us, thank you for listening. Thank you for listening intently. Thank you for showing the love that we all have for each other and listening to each other in such a beautiful way. And congratulations to everyone who was re-elected. And we look forward to bringing you another diverse and exciting year in the next 12 months. So thank you again, and we'll see you in September for our next event.